Welcome everybody to session number 5 in Boundaries. So excited about what we're going to talk about today with Rick Presley. Rick, it's been great going through all this content and pulling your wisdom. Thank you for being here.
My pleasure. It's been great.
Love it. Well, today we're going to talk about the myths of boundaries and what boundaries are not. In fact, we're going to hit these 2 bullets on our screen. We use boundaries to manage us, and then we don't use boundaries to control others. When we talk about these myths around boundaries, one of the big ones, and I'm going to be the guy. I'm going to create a caricature, and I'm going to talk about all the reasons I can't do the boundaries and what I think about boundaries, and then you straighten me out. Okay. So
Sounds fun.
The first one is come on, man, you're a therapist, Rick. If I throw a boundary down, I'm going to be so selfish. I'll just be selfish. So talk to me about, help me off the cliff on this selfish feeling.
Yeah. I think first to kind of think about these myths is to think about them as being under narratives that are kind of going on inside of us. They're thoughts. They may be really intense emotions that then create thoughts. So they're probably not something that you have even really like sit down and thought about and put words to it, but they're feelings and they're experiences that you have that keep you from setting the boundary. So in that I'm being selfish thing is, one thing I would challenge is to consider the difference between selfishness and self-centered.
Woo.
So you're being selfish is a word that we hear in Christian circles a lot. We hear them in when we're training up children in child rearing things and helping kids not be selfish and get to play fair and share and all that kind of stuff. And that's okay, but maybe there's a difference between selfishness and self-centered. Self-centered is I'm doing this because it's something I want. It's because I'm feeding my need for control. I'm feeding. I want to have this experience and I don't really care how it affects anybody else. So that would be maybe a twist in that's really, it's feeding an unhealthy part of you. Yeah. Whereas maybe selfishness in this context is allowing yourself to protect self in a healthy way, to set those boundaries because the other person that you're interacting with is not doing that for you.
Yeah.
They're not acting in a way that's helpful to the relationship. And so you got to do that for you.
Yes.
So in this context of the boundary conversation, I think selfishness is a good word.
Yeah. That's pretty good. Okay, here's the deal now. I kind of feel like I'm disobedient. I'm going to be disobedient if I don't do what everybody wants me to do. Mm-hmm. And I just hate the feeling of being disobedient. Help me with that.
Yeah. The first thing that comes to my mind is a husband and wife scenario where one spouse is aggressive, is saying you got to do this, you need to act in such a way, or you do need to do this behavior, that kind of thing.
Submit, woman, submit.
Yeah, definitely. So being disobedient is. What's the definition of that relationship?
Yeah.
Is that person in your life in a position over you where they truly do have a power and control in your life, like a boss or like a teacher or a parent? Then you got to kind of adjust, and we could dig deeper into that, but adjust what those boundaries are then and how you set them. But when you're in a peer relationship with someone that's like a best friend or a husband or wife,
yes.
That's, that issue of submission and power and control has got to be taken very delicately, because I don't think we really have the authority to tell our mate what to do. So, and then therefore on the back end of that, I think we probably have the authority to say no.
Yeah.
And set that boundary.
One of the things that I learned early on from biblical interpretation was the word submission does not equate with obedience. Mm-hmm. It is a word that has to do with attitude. What kind of an attitude am I going to approach you with? Is it a humble and sweet attitude, or is it one where I'm now subservient to you? And that's where submission moves into unhealthy realms. Anyway, that's a cool biblical way to look at it. Well, here's another one. if I set limits, if I tell somebody and set limits on all the things that they want to say and do, and they can just run ripshod in my life, and I just turn the other cheek and all that kind of stuff. If I set a limit, I'm afraid. I'm afraid I'm going to lose love.
Yeah.
I'm afraid I'm going to get hurt, and I'm trying to figure out how to have courage in the face of that, because I may not like my options.
Oh, absolutely. Again, then in close relationships, such as a marriage or a best friend kind of relationship, that relationship has meant a great deal to to whoever you are that's setting the boundary. So there was a time, maybe a long time, in which that relationship was incredibly meaningful, and then for whatever reason, it's moved into this unhealthy place. And so to set a boundary kind of means you've got to flirt with this idea of what does this mean for the long term of my relationship.
Yeah.
And then that brings up an enormous amount of fear, of guilt, of shame, of a lot of yucky feelings for a lot of people, that if I set this boundary with a spouse, then what does that mean for our relationship? And so I don't know how to deal with that.
Yeah.
I don't know how to resolve that in my spirit. And so I just float back into doing the same old thing, because that keeps the relationship going as I know it can, even though it's not changing anything.
And truly, if you're keeping yourself healthy, if your goal is to nurture self, and that's why you set up a boundary,
right.
You're not controlling anybody else, you're just setting it up to protect and nurture yourself, then if somebody does leave you, if you do experience rejection or abandonment in that moment, the reality is you had a very weak connection, if really any connection at all. It was a false intimacy based on behavioral happenings, right?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
It's just crazy. It is. Well, sometimes when I want to set a boundary, what I'm thinking is if I do that, I'm about to hurt somebody. And gosh, I just can't imagine, because I feel the energy before I even get into this in exchange, and I'm coming to this other person, I'm about to tell them I want this boundary, and they're not going to understand, because I've always allowed it. I always violated it myself. So now when I do it, they're going to have an energy reaction, and it's going to feel like they're hurting.
Yep.
And I hate feeling like I hurt somebody. So I would rather just go through the turmoil the rest of my life than to face the pain there. Talk to me.
I think boundaries will actually help you approach that person and respond to that person, that experience, with a greater level of peace. Because you've thought through what you want to do.
Yes.
You've considered, you've spent time, what is the boundary that I need to set? How do I want to communicate that? And then as we've talked in other sessions about differentiation, becoming more secure in self and having a greater sense of self, and being more in tune with, wanting to approach situations, wanting to respond to people with that fruits of the Spirit kind of thing, with that peace and love and joy and patience and long suffering. Those are going to be more present, because you're approaching a situation or a person from this place where I've thought about what I want to say, I've thought about the boundary I want to say, instead of this reactionary, emotional, limbic brain, just, you got to get out of here, you got to stop doing that, and using whatever words or behaviors to get that person to stop what they're doing.
I know when I read Dr. Cloud's book on boundaries, he made the comment, there's a difference in hurting somebody and harming them.
Yeah.
To me, that's a great aha.
Yeah,
it's like,
good.
just because somebody feels they're hurt, their feelings are hurt, it's part of being human.
Right.
But if in the long run I can serve you and love you better, then the initial hurt feelings, they don't matter. So if I'm in boundaries, if I set a boundary, doesn't that just mean I'm ticked off? Doesn't it mean that I'm lit and I'm angry? And so if I set a boundary, don't I have to wait till the steam is blowing my lid before I set a boundary? Or is a boundary something else?
Well, I think you could be angry, and I don't think that's inappropriate to necessarily be angry. But I think it goes back to the one we just talked about. I think your anger is going to be much more resolved when you do the work of boundary setting. You consider what it is they're doing that's offending me, what it is that I don't like about that, what choice do I want to make, and then what response am I going to give them and tell them as a response maybe later on in the day or even when it happens. You're going to be a lot less angry in your response when you've thought through all of this. Maybe you worked with a pastor or a therapist or somebody to kind of help you unpack what it is you need to do. You're going to be able to respond with a much less energy.
Yeah.
But the what's driving that, the whole reason you are setting a boundary is you have been angry.
Yeah. Well, there you go.
They have hurt you, and you have been angry. Oftentimes underneath anger is fear, and fear of losing something, fear of losing safety, fear of losing control or whatever. But so anger is not a bad thing.
Right.
You know.
Right.
And a lot of people are really afraid to feel angry.
Yeah.
But anger can be a big motivator to finally get something done.
Yeah, it's about justice.
Yeah.
God gets angry and he doesn't sin. So yeah, no, that's true. Well, here's a real struggle point, I think, for me. And again, I'm wanting to make sure that it aligns with so many feelings that I've had and other people have had. But here's one. The people that I want to set a boundary with, they've done so much for me.
Oh yeah.
They've given to me, they've served me, they've been there for me. They're toxic like crazy, but they do all this stuff for me. And won't it feel like I'm just saying, I don't give a rip what you've done for me? I take you for granted now?
Well, it could. It could.
Well, there you go.
But I think, you know, if you're having a reaction to something they do versus setting a boundary.
Yeah.
You know, again, I come back to that place of when you've done the work of really unpacking what it is that's going on and why I've been hurt and what I don't want to happen anymore. Then you can approach that person or even respond to a situation and love them. You can in therapy we call this kind of giving a stroke and a kick. Like give two strokes and a kick.
Stroke and a kick.
So we stroke them. We say we talk about what they're doing well and kind of build them up and then kind of kick them a little bit and say, hey, we need to change this. So, you know, in setting your boundaries, you can do that with your friend, this person who has been meaningful to you, who hasn't been helpful.
Yeah.
You can say, all of who you are is not bad.
Yeah.
You know, I really love this part about you. I love that you have this kind of heart towards the church or towards our family or whatever, and you've been so generous. But man, at the same time, there's this other thing that just doesn't work.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. That's good. Well, let's hit this last bullet. We don't use boundaries to control others. I think that is, and you and I were talking about it before we went live here, that, gosh, it's such a confusing thing for people. Talk about how we have a tendency to want to control and we try to use boundaries to do that, and how that breaks the very principle of boundaries.
Yeah. This is by far the hardest thing for most of my clients that I do boundaries work with to understand and get their mind wrapped around. Because boundaries, when you set a boundary, you really are giving up control.
Yeah.
And like I said, when we first started talking, there's these emotions that come up in us. There's these fears and anxieties and worries and stressors that person, if I don't tell them what to do, if I don't get mad at them, if I don't use some kind of level of shame or control to make sure we manage their behavior, they're going to do that to me again. Okay? And boundaries is saying you got to give them total and complete freedom to do whatever it is they're going to do.
They want to do. Yeah.
And lots of people have a really, really hard time doing that. To giving someone else complete freedom, and then understanding kind of this counterintuitive like mind shift that has to be made of getting to the other side of like, what do I do to protect me?
Yes.
While you have freedom to do what you're going to do, and you have freedom to do what you did that hurt me,
Yeah.
and I got to give you freedom to do that, it's easier to jump into trying to control you through shame, through manipulation, through guilt. whatever to keep you, because that's what's driving me to want to control you is fear.
You fear.
Huge amounts of fear of I can't be hurt like that again by you.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think the work I do is with lots of marriages, and for a spouse to give up that and to really sit in this place of giving someone freedom is by far one of the hardest things for them to do.
Because boundaries are not about controlling the other person. It's about controlling you.
Right.
And so what happens to you, you always have the power of choice for you. But anytime you try to grab the power of choice for somebody else, you're in violation of your very humanity.
Yeah.
Because God doesn't even do that. So absolutely awesome. Well, thank you guys. Excited about what y'all are going to talk about. Y'all have a blast. Boundaries, myths, and what they aren't. Get after it. See you next time.